Welcome to Perspectives in Mobile, the news podcast from the Mobile Ecosystem Forum. Join us discussing the world of telecommunications, technology, and mobile innovations. From Florence, Ricardo Amati.
Welcome to a new episode of MAP podcast series Perspectives, where we explore the latest trends and innovations shaping the mobile ecosystem, the digital revolution, and journalism. I am Ricardo Amati. Today we are joined by Liat Fainman-Adelman, manager at Financial Times Strategies. Liat is fascinated by media polarization and the challenges of misinformation in our digital age, issues that are becoming increasingly relevant as we navigate a rapidly evolving world. She'll share insights from a groundbreaking study she coordinated on young people news consumption habits, offering a glimpse into the future of media in the context of the digital revolution. Liat, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So, the study is called Next Gen News, Understanding the Audiences of 2030. Could you start by giving us an overview of the study and especially what are the main facts that you found?
For sure. So Next Gen News was a study commissioned by the Google News Initiative. So my team at FT Strategies, which is the consulting and research spin-out arm of the Financial Times based in London, we partnered with a university at Northwestern University, the journalism school Medill, to conduct research, like you said, on what the future of news consumption will look like. The way we did that is we went across India, Nigeria, and the United States to interview at length young people from all different backgrounds. We sat in their homes for over 3 hours sometimes. We met their families, we observed their phone behavior, and then tried to distill and understand, with the help of an expert team of 19 advisors, what is really happening in this ecosystem, how are young people engaging with news and media more generally, and how is that going to have an impact on the industry at large.
So you were embedded in this thing, really going inside it. And
very much so.
Why the Financial Times decided to focus on understanding the news consumption habits for the younger generation? It's not supposed to be, the FTs, it is not supposed to be, for youngster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think this is sort of an existential problem we see a lot of publishers facing. We've worked with over 700 publishers around the world at this point, and what we find is because of how the industry is structured and many publishers are either relying on subscriptions or direct to site advertisements, we see that the average subscriber or average user on a website are above the age of 40. And so that's fine for now because those are the audiences that are more easily monetized and have more disposable income. But really, for any publication, as they look ahead to the future, they're going to need to transition that next generation. Otherwise, you risk not having that strong foundation in the long term.
What are the steps of this transition, the main ones?
So, I guess as any population begins to age, they'll naturally have more disposable income. They'll become a more attractive demographic to target for your business. And why we were particularly interested in 18 to 25-year-olds is, and what we found is they are already exhibiting distinct behaviors that are all digital-based, which is quite different from previous generations. And so, maybe in the past, especially when print was more prominent, typically you'd see young people grow up with publications. So, you might be in high school or, a teenager or a young adult, and you might not be consuming news directly, but you see every day when you come home that your parents are reading the Financial Times, they're reading whatever their local paper is. And so you start to build that affinity. But with the transition to digital, there's more of a disconnect. So this was really our way of trying to understand how can legacy publishers start to, build a reputation with and engage those younger audiences for the future.
How different it goes in different continents, in different countries. I'll give you an example. I was interviewing an expert on political messaging about, it's an elections year, so it's very important. And with AI, just building deep fakes, it's very interesting. And well, in Italy, for example, where I am now, there is no political messaging. I mean, they don't do it. I mean, on the mobile phones. And in the US, I think they're going to have 25 billion political messaging during this election year. I mean, everything is so different from country to country. Is there something that unify the future of news, or it's going to be different from one side to another?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Obviously, when we're trying to understand at a global level how the industry is changing, we couldn't unfortunately look at every country because, to your point, there's such distinct, dynamics within each country, especially even within Europe. You see the Nordics behave very differently from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe, etc. But part of the reason we chose India, Nigeria, and the US, well, for one, we had the budget and the ability to cover 3 countries. And our logic was that if we can observe participants in 3 very different countries, and we can draw similarities between them, those similarities likely represent the behaviors of a much wider demographic. And I would say, obviously, India, Nigeria, and the US, there's differences between all of them. I would say approximately 70% of the behaviors we observed were the same across those 3 markets. So those are the 70% of behaviors we index to mostly in the report. And where possible, we call out the nuances across regions. But we would love to one day replicate this research in Europe, especially in Southeast Asia and South America, all over, if we could.
Right. This study highlights behaviors like digital simultasking, sophisticated searching. How do mobile devices facilitate these behaviors? And what implications do they have for news producers?
Yeah, it's a really big question. One thing we like to call out when presenting some of this research is the fact that every single person we interviewed was born after the year 2000, which meant that they essentially grew up with smartphones. And in some regions like India, they might have even skipped some layers in terms of digital adoption and have gone straight to smartphones, whereas other groups may have progressed into it. So as a result, some of those behaviors we call out, like the digital simultasking, are very specific to these digital social natives. So the digital simultasking, for example, what we noticed there was that the fluidity in which they could, multitask on their phones. We saw people even splitting their mobile phone screens, and on the bottom half, they're watching a YouTube video that's quite engaging and it's a visual, but there's also text. And then on the top half, they're playing a video game at the same time. So they're doing so many things at once. They're quite distracted in their engagement. But as a result, we also saw some interesting patterns where often they would be distracted and kind of flipping between things. But if something did spark their attention and they found it interesting for whatever reason, we could see them go down these huge rabbit holes and spend actually quite a bit of dedicated time looking into something. So yeah, there were all these nuances of how young people were looking at news and media on their phone more generally.
Right, so it's a question of engagement.
Yeah.
Right. And trust. How to build trust. Too many things in the internet. The difference between fake news and news, actual news, is very thin. And, you have people that debunk fake news, and they are debunked by the other people that think fake news are real news. So, how to build trust?
Yeah. It's a really big question, and one we were taking a look at. So one of the frameworks we developed was called the ideal news experience. This was a framework where we detail all the different components that make up a positive news experience for a young person. So there are three large components. It was trusted source, personal significance, and desired storytelling. So we did a deep dive into trusted source. And really the main difference we found here is that because young people, like this group of young people, grew up with so much information at their fingertips, and also an acute awareness that because of tools like artificial intelligence, anything they see online could be fake, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. The good piece of it is that this generation is actually quite skeptical of news. So they don't just take anything they see online as fact. Everything comes with a grain of salt. They're more likely to investigate and try and understand if this is true, if something, sparks their interest. But on the flip side, there is also this understanding that because anything could be fake, there's less of a common belief system, which lends itself likely more readily to polarization. So your worldview might be different from my worldview. And so as a result, each individual had their own anchor points of people, of, brands who they themselves would trust. And so they would almost filter through all this information they were getting through those individual sources. And that could be a friend, it could be their church pastor, it could be a food influencer. It could be anyone who they personally resonate with and look up to and therefore trust to deliver, media content and news.
Right. You took in your study, in the study that you coordinated, about different modes. Sift, substantiate, socialize. Different modes for engaging with news. How should news organizations adapt their strategies to meet this diverse consumption patterns?
Yeah, so the main finding with the modes framework, which I sort of alluded to a bit earlier, was this, there's this common conception that young people, they have no attention span. Anything they see has to be half a second in order to grab their attention. And we found there is some truth to that. And that's where the SIFT mode comes in. We detail 5 different modes. SIFT mode is sort of the all-encompassing mode. This is the idea that when you go on your phone, you have so many different notifications coming. You have friends texting you. You have, notifications from apps. You have messages on social media. So you just have a constant inflow of information. And so you're always kind of in this sifting headspace where you're trying to parse through information and content until you find something that, you're more interested in or willing to engage with a bit longer. So there is that vital moment, especially on social media, which is where young people most often are, where you do need that very short form media that's going to spark their interest. But that's not the end of the story. So once their interest is sparked, we found there were 4 different modes that they might enter into to dive deeper into the content. So some of those were sense make, so wanting to understand, is this, like, how can I make sense of this? Is this true? Can I validate this? An example we heard of sense make was, a young person saying that during COVID, restrictions were introduced in her local area, and she wanted to understand why that was, what are the parameters, etc. You might see study. Study was a really common one that came up. The idea of study is that you might want to develop yourself in a personal or professional way. So let's say I want to improve my baking skills, or we heard from a lot of young people in India that they wanted to invest for the first time. So that interest would be maybe sparked from a post they see, and that would cause them to then go Google and say, okay, what are the interest rates? What do interest rates mean? Maybe watch a YouTube video, or like WhatsApp investment tips were very common in India. So they might be interested to go down that rabbit hole. So one of the suggestions we outline in the report is the idea that you make content suitable for the SIFT mode, so the short form mode, but you have an onward journey available for them to dive deeper into the content and in different formats that might suit their different needs in that moment. So it might be a 10-minute long video, or it might be sending them to a podcast or an interactive quiz, something to engage them in a way that would make sense as a follow-on journey.
Yeah, I think this is this is the best thing of what's happening in the news. I think it's not just about size and scope, as we were saying some years ago. It's about engagement with with multiple media even, and multiple sources. That's very interesting. And there is a gap between the news experience that young people have on their mobile phones and what they currently receive. What was the biggest challenge here for publishers, journalists, and mobile phone operators, technology providers?
Definitely. So as I said earlier, this was from the Ideal News Experience framework. So the three components, I already spoke to the trusted source, but in desired storytelling and personal significance, we found some really interesting disconnections. So I think the slightly more intuitive and obvious one is with desired storytelling. So this is the idea that, still to this day, think of how many publishers are writing articles that are 800 plus words of text. That is not the go-to form of consumption for young people. And it's unlikely that they're going to grow up and start to adopt that behavior. We did see lots of examples of long-form media consumption, but the main difference with long-form media consumption was it wasn't just text, but it was often dynamic, multi-format forms of consumption. So, at the FT, for example, we develop a lot of scrolly-telling methods where you just get bits of information as you're scrolling, you're getting visuals. The idea that there's going to be some dynamic or interactive element to what you're consuming.
That's how a long form should be now.
Yeah. So that was a very common theme in disconnect. The more, existential disconnection we saw was in personal significance. So, thinking back to prior generations, there would be an incentive to consume the news in part because of maybe social pressure. You want to come into work and be able to speak about what happened in the news and feel well-read and make informed decisions, be civically engaged, all that. I think with young people, because there's just so much information, it's just too much information for any given person to take in. And so they need to be very sharp and thoughtful about what information they're going to choose to consume and not consume, especially in the context that we heard it commonly mentioned that young people are concerned about their mental health. And there's an assumption that news negatively impacts their mental health. So they have, different boundaries around what they will and won't consume. One of the reasons they would consume the news, or what they hoped the news would give them, is the ability to take action and improve their own lives and the lives of their communities. So we saw this manifest in sort of three ways. The first, most basic way, if you will, is pretty intuitive. It's getting information that is going to help just their day-to-day. So, for example, knowing the commute times, knowing what the weather is going to be like. We heard this a lot in Nigeria, especially where traffic could be sort of a nightmare, and in India. The second layer was wanting to improve your sort of circumstances. So again, kind of back to the example of wanting to invest, or let's say you want to buy a house. So that's kind of the first point in which you're actually starting to care about the economy. But again, you want it in terms that you understand. So if you tell me the interest rates go up, I don't really know what that means. But if you tell me the interest rates go up and therefore you will find it harder to buy a house, or this is how much more money you'll need to save to buy a house, that is important to me. And the final layer was engaging with social issues you personally cared about. So we heard examples, especially in the US, of, young people resonating with women's rights issues or LGBTQ issues or things of that nature. And therefore, anything related to that topic, they would want to engage in, but they would also want to play an active role in. So they would want to know, okay, if there was a hate crime or something that happened, who can I donate to? How can I spread the word? What protests can I go to? It's a very active form of engagement, not just passively engaging for the sake of knowing the information, but wanting to do something with it.
Two more questions for you. First one, how the Financial Times should change its strategies from here to 2030? I mean, I know it's a complicated question, but I'm sure that you can have at least a couple of ideas. You can't tell us everything, but a couple of things that they should do.
Yeah, so we have been invited and we've presented these findings in-house to the FT teams, to the product teams, audience engagement teams, because just like any publication, the FT also has other ways it can improve and continue to engage younger audiences. One initiative the FT has taken on recently was launching a new product called FT Edit, which is a product specifically geared towards younger audiences. And so there are a number of interesting dimensions to it. So for example, it's a lighter product. It purposefully tries to report less on just what we call quote unquote hard news, so politics and economics, and more about a wider range of topics that young people are particularly interested in. So I know climate change, for example, is a very common one. It's at a lower price point, and it has certain features to try and mimic social media platforms. So you have little stories up top so you can click into them and see what's trending. So yeah, I think the FT Edit has been somewhat of an experiment, and I'm really curious to see how that evolves, and hopefully some of our findings from Next Gen News will help shape that application, because the fact that it does charge money implies that it's still trying to target a slightly older demographic than 18 to 25-year-olds. But I think it's a great step in trying to engage that audience.
I'm sure your research will help. And about how do you see mobile devices shaping the future of news consumption over the next decade. No more
Yeah.
television, no more normal newspaper, just digital stuff? Or what's your take?
So I think this is a question the answer will vary depending on the country and region you're looking at. For example, in India, I know in Japan, print is still quite active. Granted for older generations, but we've worked with Indian publishers who still say that the 30-plus-year-old demographic, they're still buying newspapers, they're making good money off of it. That being said, of all the young people we interviewed, not a single one used print, not a single one watched the TV other than if their parents were watching the TV and they wanted to come sit with them.
That's very telling, yes.
Yeah, just to spend time with them. And very often they were still on their phones at the same time. So I think it's safe to say that mobile is not going anywhere, and that will be the dominant platform for consumption. We spoke with some, tech experts on the supply side, and it doesn't seem realistic that things like the metaverse or, VR goggles and all that will be mainstream probably in the next 10 years. Mobile will still most likely be the most important platform. And in our research, we preface some of the research by explaining part of what's interesting about this study is not only are young people an emerging and important demographic that publishers will want to target in the future, but there's also so much evidence that suggests the behaviors and especially technologies that young people adopt, older generations will start to adopt too. So you see that with smartphone adoption. Younger people were first to adopt, but then now, my grandmother has an iPhone, and she's almost 90. And you see that with news consumption, even on TikTok, younger people consuming it the most, but older demographics are also starting to consume and growing at the same rate. So all that to say, mobile will continue to be extremely important, and not just for young people, but probably for older demographics too.
Thank you, Liat. Thank you for your insights in the 2030 audiences for news. Liat Fainman-Adelman, manager at Financial Times Strategies. Thank you for staying with us.
Amazing.
And that's all for this episode of Perspective, the math podcast where experts and industry leaders talk about what they think, see and expect in the world of technology, telecommunications, innovative mobile services and media. Stay tuned. From Riccardo Amati, goodbye and good luck with your work.
Thanks for listening to Perspectives in Mobile. Join us next as we explore telecoms, technology, and mobile innovations. Stay tuned, stay connected, and let's unlock the mobile potential together.